not everyone is born with perfectly balanced hormones. By the time you're 40, a bunch of those hormones are going to be significantly reduced. By the time you're 60, some of the most important ones will have absolutely cratered. This happens all the time. People who seem to have everything, who even go as far as ending their own lives. I think how you feel inside is the most important thing. Hormones are one of, if not the primary thing that determines how you feel in the moment. And what I have found is that if you can tweak the hormones, it's so much easier. So the other big thing that determines how you feel to me is your neurological habits. If you're used to reacting in a certain way to a certain situation, then it's very, very tempting to not do that. It's like you've practiced it thousands, millions of times.
Welcome to the Rejuvenate podcast. I'm your host, Chrissy Hawks, and I am here with my co-host, Elwin Robinson. And today we are discussing Elwin's favorite hormone supplements. So Elwin, why did we decide this today? Why did you decide that, yes, let's discuss this?
Well, this one really is a long time coming, and I would have done it earlier. I felt I had enough mastery and understanding to do it, but I'm glad I waited because I feel at the stage now where I can really share what I think is the most effective. Why do it in general? So, the name of this podcast, the Rejuvenate podcast, one of the two big brands that I'm really, all in on is Feel Younger. And so I very specifically call it Feel Younger instead of like look younger or live longer, even though those are maybe more established areas of focus, because to me, it's all about how you feel. And I learned that from many great spiritual teachers throughout the ages have said this, and many great personal development teachers have said this, is like, you could be surrounded with everything you think you want, right? Whether it's a palace and kingdom and money and gold or people who love you, huge family, whatever your fantasy is of like the ultimate scenario. And yet you can be in a position where you're depressed, where you're anxiety, where you have low self-esteem, you're riddled with lack of self-confidence, you feel maybe even so bad that you feel suicidal. And this happens all the time. We get all kinds of stories about this, in the news of people who seem to have everything, who even go as far as ending their own lives. So how does that happen? I think it happens because the most important thing is how you feel inside, not what someone else is telling you should feel, given what your outside circumstances are. And I remember experiencing the opposite as well. I remember a period in my life when I was just turned 30 or was about to turn 30, and everything was not working out. The relationship had just ended, and I had no money. I was, in fact, extremely in debt, no career prospects. I was living in a family member's attic. I was a real loser by any standards for a 30-year-old, and I just felt happy for no good reason. And it was when I felt that feeling, I knew that things would turn around. And in fact, they quickly did. Within a year, everything was going, and I had a business, and I had a mission, and I had, grateful customers and good friends and all the rest of it. So I think how you feel inside is the most important thing. And a lot of people who teach like how to manifest what you want, they say, think about what it is that you want, and then how would it make you feel? So let's say, I'd like a house, I would like, this dream career or whatever. They go, okay, see how it makes you feel, and then like keep eliciting that feeling in yourself, and you'll draw that experience to you. That sounds like hokum to like very skeptical, cynical people, but even to them, if they're open-minded, they have to see that if you have a good attitude, you're actually much more likely to make things happen or be able to take advantage of opportunities to get the life or the circumstances you want. So how you feel inside is super, super important. Okay. Now, how you feel inside is controlled by a lot of different factors. And obviously the outside world does have an impact on how you feel, but it's not as crucial as we're all kind of hypnotized into believing. Hypnotized by the culture, by other people, by ourselves, by, programming from the media, from this, that, whatever. We're taught to believe, maybe cynically by, outside interest, if in order to be happy, in order to feel good, we have to have all this stuff. We have to have the car, we have to have the house, we have to have the wife or husband, we have to have the whatever, the job.
Yeah, but that's conditional living, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And then the other side of that is the kind of spiritual side, which says, you know what, that's not true. Start with how you feel inside, and all the good stuff will come to you. That is kind of true, but there's one catch. if you have years, decades, and perhaps even many generations of programming in you, of responding to life in a certain way. So if you're used to feeling like a victim, if you're used to feeling like the world is a scary place, if you're used to feeling like, you're not good enough, whatever it might be, these kind of things, it's very, very difficult to get out of that mode and go into the mode of feeling grateful or feeling confident or feeling loving or whatever it is that you really actually do want to feel, feeling fulfilled. And so what I've observed is, and I've known a lot of people in the world of, spirituality and self-development, and I've met some really wonderful people. I've met some frauds, but I've also met a lot of people who are really trying hard and it's not working for them very well. And, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And so what I've really observed and learned over the last few years is that hormones are the key to how we feel on an everyday level. Now, other things are the key to hormones in turn, right? So it can get complicated, like lifestyle factors, nutritional factors, toxicity factors. It can get complicated, but let's keep it simple for a second. Hormones are one of, if not the primary thing that determines how you feel in the moment. The thing that determines how you feel ultimately is actually kind of neurochemicals, neurotransmitters like dopamine and GABA and serotonin and things like that. But those are very transitory. They really don't last long. Often they will change like radically within the course of seconds or minutes. But the thing that sets the overall tone on a hourly, daily, weekly, monthly basis is hormones. They're the ones who will dictate it. And so if what I've observed is that, okay, so for instance, let's say you want to be a spiritual person, you're like, I'm not going to be angry anymore. Or let's say you want to be a confident person, you're like, I'm not going to be anxious anymore. Or let's say you want to be a successful person, you're going to say, I'm not going to have feelings of like self-doubt anymore. Okay. And then every time it comes up, first of all, you got to have enough awareness to realize it's come up. And then you got to use your discipline and your willpower to like not buy into it, depending on what technique you're using it. Maybe you like ignore it, like, no, I can do it, or no, I am good enough, or something like that. You like reframe it. Like there's a lot of work involved. It's exhausting to try and change your fundamental way of being that way. And it can work. And for many people it does, who are like examples, role models for, maybe a lot of us. But a lot of the time it's really difficult. And even those people often do fall short, as you realize when you spend more behind the scenes time with them. And so what I have found is that if you can tweak the hormones, that it's so much easier to do all those things that we talked about. And the list is much longer. It's so much easier to feel fulfilled if you have enough oxytocin. It's so much easier to feel confident if you have enough testosterone and DHT. It's so much easier to feel calm if you have enough progesterone or allopregnanolone. It's so much easier to feel joyful if you have enough thyroid hormone. And I could go on, but those are some good examples. And of course, it's not only about what you have, it's also about what you don't have, right? So it's very difficult to feel calm if you have loads of adrenaline and cortisol going through your system. But in that case, having sufficient progesterone and other things would help to balance that out, stop that from getting out of control. So those hormones are really key.
So what I'm hearing you really say is that ultimately how we feel comes down to our hormones. I mean, there's throw in a couple of neurotransmitters and things like that, but happiness or hormones equal happiness.
Kind of, yes. The neurotransmitters definitely on a real level, but the thing is they're so changeable moment to moment. So it's like the hormones orchestrate the neurotransmitters to a large degree. And because the hormones are much longer acting, it makes more sense to focus on the hormone level than the neurotransmitter level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that absolutely does. Let me ask you this, because there could be, I mean, you made the really great distinction. You were, not in the best circumstances, but yet you felt good. So you knew that there was, things like that. And then you also made the opposite view of there's a lot of people out there who seem to have absolutely everything, but they feel horrible and they're in the dumps. So let me ask you this. What comes first? Circumstances or hormones?
So that's a great question. And so that's the thing. You can override in both directions. So the other thing that determines how you feel, the other big thing from my perspective, other than and I call it your internal biochemical reality, which is like your hormones and your neurotransmitters. So the other big thing that determines how you feel to me is your neurological habits. So if you're used to reacting in a certain way to a certain situation or certain type of situation, then it's very, very tempting to not do that when you've done it. It's like you've practiced it thousands, millions of times. Like for me, getting irritated when something doesn't go the way I think it should is a habit I've practiced millions of times in my life. And so that's a neurological pathway that's like a really, really easy road for me to go down. It's well paved, it's really clear, there's bright lights in it. I know exactly how to go down that road. Now, going down the road of, accepting or being grateful or being open to, maybe this is actually a good thing. Those are all routes that are also open to me in that moment. But then they're roads that are like darker and I'm not quite sure. And like there's potholes and there's rocks in the way. And I'm like, that's not a path that's very well trod in comparison to that. And so with the power of my mind, and this is what all the, to various degrees, the different spiritual, even religious and personal development people teach, I can choose to go down the other paths. I can choose to be accepting instead of irritated or whatever, right? But the thing is, first of all, it's a neurochemical habit to go down that pathway of irritation. Second of all, if there's also a biochemical habit of adrenaline in this case. And so when you have a tendency for high adrenaline and you have this path you've trod down a million times of being irritated, and that's only me, I'm just talking about me, but for someone else it may be feeling defeated, or for someone else it may be feeling victimized or blaming other people, or whatever it might be, right? But if that path is familiar to you, and then you have the fuel for it, which is the hormone, in this case let's say adrenaline for me, then it's very, very, very difficult. It requires a lot of effort and willpower and discipline and self-awareness and all the rest of it to not go down that path that's so familiar and so fueled. Now, what I've observed is when you take away the fuel or replace the fuel, there's still the neurological habit, but there's no oomph behind it anymore. There's no like a rocket pushing you down there. There's just, oh yeah. And it's much, much easier to go, maybe I'll just, just accept the situation or, be open and curious about what might come from it. Like those paths seem much more possible to go down, even though there's that strong neurological habit, because there's not the fuel almost forcing me down that way. In fact, the fuel now, let's say, is actually gently guiding me down the path of acceptance instead. So the hormones, although they don't rewrite those neurological habits, and as I said, those could be not only have been there a whole lifetime, but you may have imprinted them from your parents, who may have imprinted them from their parents. So this might be an intergenerational neurological habit that you're trying to overcome. And so that's not particularly easy to do, but fundamentally shifting the hormonal balance makes that way, way easier. Now, if you take someone with zero self-awareness, zero desire for self-improvement, and you just change the hormones, the improvement they make is probably going to be more incremental because, yeah, they have less fuel for going down the same path as always, but they still, they're used to it, so they'll still do it a lot, maybe with less force than before, whether it's the path of despair or the path of anger or whatever it might be. But if you have someone, I think probably everyone watching this podcast is that kind of person who's actually committed to self-improvement, it just makes it so much easier to go down a path that you would prefer to go down if you shift the hormones.
You touched on a really, really good point I just want to circle back to, which is the intergenerational habits, because I think that is so key that so many of us don't understand that actually a lot of us are, we're just following what we watched as we were raised. We're just copying our parents' behavior. So it's not necessarily even our behavior, it's just learned behavior. And so, you've got that aspect of like, well, why did you do that? when people say, well, I don't really know, it's because it's that potentially that neural pathway that has been so ingrained since birth. And essentially, I think, what I'm hearing here is that for one, a person, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's got to be the awareness for the want of change. And then here you're showing us that the way to change is by adjusting those hormones. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm saying if a person has no desire to change, but you fundamentally change the balance of their hormones, they will change a bit anyway, because the fuel is suddenly going in an opposite or very different direction from before. Because remember, there's that correlation. So for instance, if you have that tendency to go to irritation, or if you have that tendency to go into depression, in either case, that may well be a neurological habit that goes back several generations, but that tendency probably also comes from a biochemical reality. So for me, for instance, I have a tendency to high adrenaline. My ancestors, let's just say, had that tendency to high adrenaline. And so when you have that tendency to high adrenaline, it's natural to go down that pathway. For a different person, maybe their tendency is more to high serotonin, which I'm starting to understand maybe thing actually that leads to more of that kind of self-defeating pattern. And so if they have that tendency, then they're going to go down a different pathway. Or, if you have very high levels of estrogen, then it can turn you down a different pathway. So yeah, different hormones can make different pathways feel natural to you. And then they tend to get passed down generation upon generation upon generation, and then both get passed down. The hormonal imbalance towards a certain hormone being dominant gets passed down generation to generation, and the neurological habit gets passed down generation to generation. And when you have that much momentum and entropy pushing in that direction, it can work to interrupt it by changing how you think and how you react to things. But it's a hell of a lot easier if you also change the biochemical reality with the hormones.
That makes absolute sense, because there's some people that are saying, I don't know why I keep doing that. So it's like, if it's in the genetic, if it's been there for a really long time, and there's everything else, it's like, well, okay, yeah, no wonder. So there's light at the end of the tunnel. So that's why you're here.
Yeah.
Well, the next question that's going to come up is, hang on a second. Isn't supplementing with hormones unnatural? I mean, aren't we supposed to just, isn't our body just supposed to make what it makes without taking something external?
Yeah, a lot of people have a lot of concern about doing this, I would say, and to some degree it's justified. However, I have a few reasons why I have changed my mind about this, and I do believe now in many cases it is a good idea, and at least I can explain why I decided for myself it's a good idea. So as I said, not everyone is born with perfectly balanced hormones. It's not even as if we're born with perfectly balanced ones and then we ruin it by lifestyle and diet and taking drugs and all the things that can ruin our hormones. No. It's actually, we can be born with completely imbalanced hormones. We can be born with way too much estrogen in relation to progesterone. We can be born with low testosterone. We can be born with low oxytocin. And all these things have been absolutely demonstrated to me and proven to me with the genetic insights, with our hormonal reports. It goes through all of that. For me, it was a revelation to say, yeah, I have a tendency to low thyroid. Yeah, I have a tendency to high cortisol. That's going to, really dictate and has dictated a lot of the course of my whole life. And so that's one thing. Another thing is, if we have lived an unnatural life up until now.
What do you mean by unnatural life?
Yeah, so if you've had electric lights, if you have had air conditioning, if you've had, electric heating, if you have not touched the ground, if you're not walking 4 to 6 hours a day, which is average, if you're not getting sun throughout the day, if you're not getting fresh air throughout the day, if you're not eating organic food that's grown or raised locally, all of that stuff, right? And so, of course, by that definition, we all live unnatural lives. There's indigenous tribes maybe in certain areas of the world that are almost treated like a curiosity because it's so unusual that someone might actually live naturally, that someone might actually live relatively in alignment with nature. I'm not against civilization. I think there's absolutely benefits to it. We can do what we're doing now without it. But I think we have to be real about the fact that with civilization, there comes a significant drawback. So we don't live a natural life. We just have to get over that. Nothing about our lives are natural. Staring at a screen is not natural, obviously, which most of us spend most of our waking lives doing these days. All of it, thoroughly, thoroughly unnatural. So because we don't live natural lives, it's going to affect our hormones, and it's going to have often a detrimental effect on our hormones. Now, that's lifestyle, and there's also toxic exposure, right? So, for example, there's all kinds of estrogens these days. Xenoestrogens, which is man-made estrogens, like flooding us in our drinking water, in all kinds of foods, in skincare products, in plastics that we're just touching with our skin. So we're being bombarded with estrogen. So that is going to have an impact on every other hormone in our body. So we have to just accept that that's a reality. And the last point is, okay, let's imagine that even none of that was the case. So we're not living on natural lives that fundamentally change our hormones. We haven't, we were born with perfect balanced hormones. We didn't have any hormonal imbalances passed on to us by our parents. Okay, even in that situation, a 40-year-old or a 60-year-old is going to have much less optimal hormones than a 20-year-old, specifically in that situation. A 20-year-old is likely to have a fairly optimal balance of hormones, 20, 25-year-old, something like that. By the time you're 40, a bunch of those hormones are going to be significantly reduced. By the time you're 60, some of the most important ones will have absolutely cratered, especially for women, but in this day and age, often for men just as much. So the other question is, okay, well, if you want to be natural, then there's a kind of inbuilt, like you're not supposed to feel on top of the world at 60 or even really 40. The way nature seems to design this is fairly cruel, which is like we get to an age of reproduction and then we're kind of at our prime.
You're out. You're done. You're obsolete. Move on.
So we're at our prime when we're at our most fertile or potent. And then beyond that, like you just said, we're done. As far as nature is concerned. And so we have to choose. Do I want to accept that nature considers me, largely unnecessary and that it's down-regulating everything that makes me feel good? Or do I want to change the tide on that? So those are three big reasons why I think having an attitude of supplementing hormones is not natural and therefore I don't want to do it is based on really faulty thinking.
Just out of curiosity, you said that there's some hormones that drop off at and are pretty much cratered by the time we're 60. Could you list those here? I'm curious.
DHEA, for instance, which we'll talk about, 80% drop between 20 and 60. For women, progesterone, more than that, maybe a 90% drop, depending on circumstances, but usually growth hormone, at least a 50% drop. Testosterone for men is much more variable, but these days, at least a 50% drop by the time you're 40 from 20. So, and thyroid, the one that most people are not focused on. But from what I see, especially with women, because estrogen is antithetical, it's like antagonistic, to thyroid, and women have estrogen, from like 15-ish onwards, very high. So that's why underactive thyroid is more common in women. So for women, thyroid hormone is maybe not such a staggeringly high percentage drop, but in terms of level of feeling good and functioning, it's still a massive drop. So I don't think, in fact, I'm trying to think if there's anything on my list that doesn't drop off. Maybe oxytocin is more dependent on other factors. And for women, like they get a massive dose of progesterone if they get pregnant. So that will, but then it drops off again, which is often what leads to postpartum depression and stuff after the birth. Like after the birth, the progesterone goes right back down again. So I actually can't think of a hormone that I'm going to talk about that's good that doesn't drop off. And the ones that tend to be the ones that are too high that cause the problems, like insulin and cortisol, that are and estrogen, that are very much implied when it comes to why people, gain fat, why people age prematurely, why they get chronic diseases. Those are the ones that don't drop off. Those are the ones that just keep increasing. So, well, except for estrogen in women, which does drop off after menopause as well. But yeah, with that exception.
I mean, hearing what you just said in that list, I mean, that is pretty shocking. Because without looking into this, I would have just thought, well, everything kind of just stays. Yeah, okay, we get older, but not having the understanding or the distinction of, okay, why aging is so crappy. Why, like, okay, that's it. You're just going to feel like, sorry, crap until you kick it. But I have, something that's popping up for me is that even with those facts, that information of those hormones falling off, there might still be a few people who say like, ooh, this is dangerous. I don't want to mess with hormones. What would you say to somebody like that? I mean, like, are they dangerous in any way?
Some of them can be. So it is true that, like, in an ideal world, again, you would do like lifestyle, nutritional, and toxicity reducing strategies, which will get you healthier. The right level of exercise for you, which varies widely, and more sunlight during the day, more darkness at night. All of that stuff, all of the lifestyle stuff you've heard from everyone before, more organic food, etc., etc., etc. However, the challenge is all the stuff I've just said. First of all, it's going to drop off anyway, no matter how healthy your lifestyle is, to some degree. Maybe it won't drop off as severely as all of the stuff I just said if a person is living optimally. In fact, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't drop as severely if someone is living optimally, but it's still going to drop off. And of course, all the lifestyle stuff is not necessarily going to make up for the passed on generation by generation genetic tendencies for hormonal imbalances, like I've talked about. So that can't be dealt with it before. So lifestyle and supplement is safer. It's often a good place to start with nutrients. Like if you can easily have a hormone deficiency just because you've got a nutrient deficiency, like zinc or magnesium or something like that. Some of the B vitamins, very common. So that's very important as well. But here's the challenge. A lot of people, they just want to feel better now. And a lot of people are feeling so bad that if you give them a list, here are the foods that you should eat and shouldn't eat every day. Here are the skincare products you should and shouldn't use, cleaning products you shouldn't use, clothing that you should or shouldn't use, depending on how toxic it is, the exercise you should and shouldn't do, the foods you should and shouldn't eat, the relationships that you should and shouldn't have, the jobs you should and shouldn't have, the attitude to life you should and shouldn't have, the activities that you should and shouldn't engage in. I mean, it's a hell of a lot. And most people are not going to want to do it. And even the ones who want to do it are often going to struggle to actually do it because they're not feeling good. And when people don't feel good, they reach for things that make them feel better, or they go back to neurological habits that are familiar. And so even if they're self-destructive, even if they're getting involved in abusive dynamics with people or traumatic situations or all of that stuff, if it's familiar, often people go to it. So I've asked hormone doctors this question, and they offer, the best answer I heard is like, it can be, but it's nowhere near as dangerous as staying as you are. That's a good
point. That's a really good point.
Depending. Now, there are a couple of them that you really have to be careful with. So, we'll go through one at a time and I'll address how safe they are. But in general, yes, messing with your hormones is a bad idea and is dangerous. But you know what messes with your hormones? Alcohol, cannabis, most prescription drugs, going to bed too late, not sleeping enough, working too much, not getting enough sunlight, on and on and on and on. All those things are already messing with your hormones. Tap water, estrogen in the water, plastics. I mean, it's never ending. So you've already messed with your hormones. You watching right now, yes, you guaranteed. Even if you're not doing it anymore, you did for probably decades before you started being healthy. So your hormones are already messed with. So that's how I look at it.
Well, that's a pretty big thing. So yeah, they already are. And you're absolutely right. I mean, just the things we ingest daily, they are affecting them. So yeah, let's get into it. Let's start off the list. So Elwin, what's first on the list?
So my favorite hormone of all has to be thyroid hormone. And I'll be specific with that. It's T3. I don't take T3 without T4. You want to have a combination. But I say that because a lot of people who do take thyroid hormone, they only take T4. My understanding from, again, having read a lot of doctors' books and having talked to a lot of doctors who specialize in this kind of hormones, is that T3 and T4 together is better in most cases. So T3 hormone, why is it one of my favorite hormones or my favorite hormone? For me, what I love about it is the amount of joy that it brings into my life. I mean, thyroid is really the most broadly beneficial hormone of all, from my point of view. Because if you have an optimal level of thyroid, then what that means is that you have an optimal level of signal to your mitochondria, which are the little energy factors inside your body, inside your cells, making energy. So you have an optimal amount of energy. Now, when we think of energy, we're like, energy to get out of bed, energy to work hard, energy to work out. But I'm not talking about that necessarily, although it is that. I'm talking about energy for your immune system to function properly, energy for your digestive system to function properly, energy for your nervous system to function properly, which includes the ability to calm down. Often, if the nervous system doesn't have enough energy, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are like tired. It could actually mean you can't sleep properly, like because you're just overly stimulated. So, energy for your muscles, energy for your cardiovascular system, energy for every system of your body, every cell of your body is dependent on the optimal level of thyroid. And that's why, what I learned is having an optimal level of that is absolutely crucial. It's the prerequisite for everything else. And so everything else I'm going to recommend as well in terms of hormone supplementation is good. But sometimes I would not start with thyroid. If a person is already highly overstimulated and anxious, then thyroid can make that worse. If a person is very nutritionally deficient, then I wouldn't start with thyroid, because thyroid, by increasing your metabolism, it will increase your nutritional demands. And so sometimes I wouldn't start with thyroid. But the reason, like if I, had to be on a desert island and they said you can only take one, pill with you or whatever, it would be thyroid, no question, because that gives every system of my body, including my brain, the energy that it needs to function the best that it can on a theoretical level. But in terms of how I feel, it gives me joy.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. I just need to take a moment to quickly tell you about a way that you can support the podcast by getting high quality, affordable supplements that Elwin and I personally use, and that's Feel Younger. What I love about Feel Younger is they have great quality products with minimal fillers, but the prices are very affordable. You can call their customer support team 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, and in my experience, they're really helpful and friendly. And what I love most of all is the amazing descriptions Elwin's written for each product category about that topic. There's so much information and education on it. I've actually learned more from reading their product descriptions than I have from most articles. So, to support the podcast, please use Feel Younger for all your supplement needs. And to let them know we sent you, you can use promo code RejuvenateMe for a 20% discount off your first order at feelyounger.net. That's 20% off your first order with promo code RejuvenateMe at feelyounger.net. You made a really good point there, is that, if there's not enough of those building blocks, those nutritional aspects, trying to rev up the engine or get everything working more, by doing that, that's just going to put you into, my understanding is, put you into a deeper deficit, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, if you're already low in really any nutrient, and especially the most important nutrients, and then you increase your metabolism, it could very well make you feel worse. So that's something that you have to be very careful of and aware of. And so personally, I would not recommend people just take it without supervision from a doctor. I think it's one of the only two things on this list that I've got that it's literally, you really shouldn't ever do it without a doctor. Ideally, you do everything with the supervision of a doctor who understands everything I'm saying here or more and can really guide you with it. But this is the red light, absolutely don't do it without someone who understands it So even though it's my favorite, it does have to be treated with caution.
And for if somebody, let's say they're like, oh, do I need thyroid? I mean, like, what would somebody generally be using it for? Is it purely for energy? If they're feeling fatigued, or they're like, I just can't get out of bed, is that what they would go to thyroid for?
The classics are, lack of energy, fatigue, constipation, dry skin, weight gain without the ability to lose weight. Potentially, anxiety, kind of depression symptoms as well. Classic blood markers, other than thyroid ones, are high cholesterol. That's a classic sign.
Why would that be?
Because thyroid helps the conversion of cholesterol into the next step, which is pregnenolone. So when you don't have enough thyroid, the cholesterol builds up. There's more, but that's like the reasons why people. Oh, and feeling cold. That's another thing. If you feel cold frequently, then that is a classic sign of low thyroid as well. And a lot of people don't realize about feeling cold. They just think it's normal to be cold in a lot of circumstances. Just the other day, my wife said to me, like whenever both her and I flew, we'd always feel cold, in the airplane, and have to put like an extra layer on. And she said, yeah, I did. I flew to, she flew last week, and she's like, yeah, I felt like completely normal temperature, like no, need to put anything else on. I was like, yeah, I haven't flown in years, so I'll be interested to see if that's the case. I'm during flying next month, but I expect it is. So it's not necessarily that you're cold all the time, but it's the fact that you get easily cold, which, to me, would be an indicator of low thyroid as well. And of course, just everything, because everything else, including all the other hormones that we'll talk about in different segments, their optimal functioning is dependent on the right level of thyroid.
Yeah, I know about the whole airplane thing. I'd make sure I'd have a nice big woolly jumper in my suitcase so I could bundle up, because otherwise it was always freezing. So I totally understand that one. So what would be the best form with thyroid?
That's a good question. So if you're into being natural, then definitely what's called natural desiccated thyroid, even as in the title, often shortened to NDT. I use the Armour brand, which I think was the original one. There are certainly other ones. And so what is that? That's literally the gland of an animal. The benefits of that are that it is natural. It has a ratio which occurs in nature, and it also perhaps has other constituents in there, like thyroid peptides. There's also T3 and T4 as what they would prescribe you as like an isolated compound, but there is also T1 and T2 in a glandular thyroid, which they're not sure if it's beneficial, but it might be. So the natural kind of whole food version of it would be a thyroid glandular. Perfectly adequate though, and in a certain situation actually superior, is a compounded combination of T3 and T4. Different people have different opinions in the ratio of that. The classic glandular ratio is like 4 parts T4 to 1 part T3. T3 is known to be 4 times as active as T4, so that means it's roughly the same amount of each. Some people disagree on that. Some people think even 2 to 1 is good, 2 parts T4 to 1 part T3. Some people say it should be 10 parts T4 to 1 part T3. So there's not a lot of, consensus on that. But generally kind of the middle point of the same as the glandular is, probably what you would err on the side of caution with. Now, why might the synthetic version actually be preferable? One reason is if you have a tendency to autoimmunity, and certainly if you already have autoimmunity.
And why would that be?
Because your immune system, if you're having 2 compounds versus like thousands of compounds in the glandular, your immune system is much more likely to react to. If it reacts to any one of the thousands in the glandular, then you've got an immune response to thyroid. Whereas if you're only taking the isolated T3 and T4, there's only 2 things for it to potentially react to. So it still happens that there's an autoimmune response to pure T3 and T4, but it's much less frequent.
And how would somebody use it?
So usually, the great thing about thyroid, as opposed to a lot of other hormones that are trickier to use, is it's literally a pill or a tablet that you swallow. In the case of Armour thyroid, it's a tablet that you swallow. I do know some people who also sell it as a transdermal, which I think is interesting and potentially effective as well. So those are the only two types that I have ever seen.
And with that, I mean, I know we've briefly, I think it was on one of our episodes we just recorded, you talked about spacing it through the day. Now, if somebody's having a pill, how would they do that?
Well, you can cut up the pill. There's a pill cutter, or you can get pills, and this is what my doctor's provided for me, that are less than a day's dose. So with the case of the glandular, the dosage is in grains. So, with my doctor, he says to do one first thing and then one later in the day. And so I get 1 grain first thing, 1 grain later in the day. Now, Ray Peat, who we've talked about a lot, he talks about how the T3 gets cleared very quickly, like after about 3 hours. And so he personally would top up with a little bit of T3, a small amount every few hours on top of the basic T3, T4 combination. So in terms of how to use it, obviously with a doctor's supervision is best. Broder Barnes is one of the first people I think who really help people to be aware of thyroid, because I know some people, and I have a best friend like this, he will not see a medical doctor no matter what, and he's always trying stuff. So I have to have kind of advice for him. Because if I don't, he's gonna be even worse off. So it's always better to do it under the supervision of a doctor, without a doubt, but a doctor who actually understands everything that we're talking about here. But if you absolutely do not want to do that, then Broder Barnes said, I can't verify this, but he was a medical doctor who had a whole team of other medical doctors underneath him. He said that what you want to do is check your temperature, your underarm temperature specifically. You need to use one of those mercury type thermometers. They're not mercury these days, but they're some, I think, thallium or gallium, some kind of replacement for mercury. You need to use one of those and put it in your armpit for like 10 minutes at least, and then check it. They're much more reliable than the electric ones.
I'm guessing the mercury is going to be more accurate.
Yeah, much more accurate. You can see with the electric one, you do it, they turn it off, turn it back on, do it again, and it's like a couple of points difference, which it makes all the difference in the world. So what Dr. Broder Barnes said is that, first of all, okay, when do you test your temperature? Not first thing in the morning, not last thing at night. Better to check it after a meal, because sometimes your temperature can be artificially increased by stress chemicals, and that's least likely to happen directly after a meal. The meal calms you down. So, or if you're stressed, it calms you down. If you're not stressed, it actually stimulates you. So it depends where you're at. And what he said is anything less than 97.8 is, he defined as hyperthyroidism. And he actually said anything more than 98.2 could be hyper, meaning you're overdoing it. So that is how I'm not saying you should, but that's how he recommended to his clients, patients, to monitor the amount of thyroid that they're having and make sure it's not excessive, or make sure it's not, insufficient as well. Now for women, this gets even more complicated than all the stuff I said, because women's temperature fluctuates through the month, and it's women, unfortunately, who need it more. So for women, you have to test it second or third day of the menstrual cycle, so just after the period's begun. If you're still menstruating. If you're not menstruating, then it doesn't matter. You can do it any day. But if you're menstruating, then you need to do it at that point in the menstrual cycle for the temperature reading to be accurate.
And what about safety concerns with supplementing with thyroid?
Yeah, they're significant. You absolutely can overdo it with thyroid. That's why it's sold as a drug. To me, that's the main reason. A lot of the hormones that I talk about are actually sold as dietary supplements, at least in the US. But thyroid is definitely not one of them. I think there's very few countries it's available over the counter. And that's because if you accidentally take far too much of most of these hormones once, it will not be an emergency room situation. And with the thyroid, it absolutely could be. You can definitely overdo it with thyroid. It is a very, very powerful thing. So, and also if you're just taking it willy-nilly, without being aware of all the stuff that I'm talking about, and, without doing tests and blood tests and all the rest of it to make sure you're not overdoing it. So it can be a real issue if you overdo it, even a little bit every day. And it can be a real issue if you overdo it a lot, even once. So it is dangerous. You'd have to do a lot for it to be really life-threatening. And my understanding is if you overdose, generally they're just going to tell you to stop unless it is really extreme, in which case they do have medical interventions. But it's not something you want to mess around with. If you accidentally take way too much pregnenolone or progesterone, it's not a good idea. But I can tell you, if you call 911 and tell them that this is what's happened, they probably won't send an ambulance. That's really the distinction. So it is dangerous to overdo it, either even a little bit for a long time or to overdo it by a lot, even once.
So what I'm hearing is thyroid takes care of so much. And if that is dysregulated in any way, then it's kind of like a domino effect for everything else. So that's one to really get right.
Yes, because for many, many, many reasons, but for me, the primary one being, if you don't have enough thyroid, you're not going to be producing enough energy in the right way, in the optimal metabolism way. And so your body will have to go to a backup system to produce energy, which in terms of, the energy production itself, it's like glycolysis and gluconeogenesis and all these less efficient ways of creating energy, which create a lot more toxic byproducts and utilize things that you actually, don't need to, that you don't want to overuse. And on a how you feel level, they do that by increasing stress chemicals. So basically, if your thyroid is underactive, and that's really what we're talking about, the overactive is much more rare and is a medical condition outside anything I can comment on. But if your thyroid hormone is under optimal, then you will be running on stress no matter what. Doesn't matter how much you meditate, doesn't matter how much you smile, and doesn't matter how much you think happy thoughts, and actually doesn't matter how non-stressful your life might be compared to some people. Like, no matter what, you will be stressed much more than is optimal if your thyroid's low. So because stress is prematurely aging, it's the opposite of rejuvenating. It's anti-juvenating. That's another reason why thyroid's number one to me.
So get your thyroid right. So Elwin, what's next on the list?
So the next one will be a surprise as my favorite hormone, because it's considered to be a female hormone. But for me, there is nothing like it, and it's progesterone. So progesterone is considered to be the female hormone because of its crucial role in the whole gestation of children. But progesterone actually has extremely wide-reaching beneficial uses throughout the body for both men and women. This has happened with a few different hormones where they look at where a person has the highest level and they assume it's only for that. So with prolactin, for a long time, they thought that the main effect of it was to cause lactation in women, because that is when a person would have the highest level of it. But it turns out prolactin is actually a big deal and is a problem in excess for men and women in all kind of situations. Oxytocin is another one that they kind of thought it was a childbirth hormone because it's so high in women and baby immediately before and after birth. But it's actually, crucial for a feeling of well-being for men and women at all parts of life. And so progesterone is another case like that. And in fact, I would say progesterone is the biggest case of that of all. So the reason why I love progesterone is because it's the anti-stress hormone more than anything else. Now, for women, it is their primary anti-stress hormone. Men have another anti-stress hormone and a kind of metabolite of it called testosterone. So testosterone is also an anti-stress hormone for men. And it's one of the reasons why on the psychometric scales, women tend to score higher on neuroticism on average. Obviously, there are many men who are more neurotic than many women, but just purely on average, women tend to experience higher levels of negative feelings than men. And it is simply because they only have one major hormone which helps them to stay calm. That's my understanding of it. And so now testosterone is also important to women. They just have a lot less than men. Usually a tenth as much, 10%, if that, usually even less than that. So for women, progesterone is really crucial. But you know what? My testosterone in my blood test results for several years have been really high. Testosterone above the scale, free testosterone at the top of the scale, still full of anxiety.
Why do you think that is? Is that just the balance within where your stress chemicals then are also really high in relation to the testosterone? Or does that mean that you don't have a lot of progesterone? I mean, like, talk me through that real quick.
So I have a genetic tendency to high cortisol, and so that does create a knock-on effect in a lot of areas. I also have a genetic tendency to higher estrogen or estrogen dominance. And so both of these are stress chemicals, really. We've covered that in more detail in different episodes, so I'll just assert that for now and let people look that up. We've done a long clip recently on progesterone and estrogen. So because of that, I have a tendency to low DHEA, which tends to compete with cortisol and be depleted by excess cortisol. And I have a tendency for a low level of progesterone, which competes with estrogen. And so these are one of those things where having high levels of one will diminish the level of the other. And what matters more is the ratio rather than the absolute level of it. So I've had a tendency to high level of estrogen compared to progesterone and a high level of cortisol in relation to DHEA. And so even very high testosterone was not enough to make me not feel anxious. Very high testosterone was enough to not make me, cower in the corner, which there was a little bit of cowering, to be honest, in the last few years, but not that much, because testosterone gives you that, come on, fight kind of impetus. So it can get you fighting again, but it can't get you relaxed and happy again so easily on its own when it's fighting all those other things. And so I think that pattern is the thing that leads more to irritation, So you're not necessarily full of, low self-esteem and depression and all the rest of it, but you're still, irritable and potentially anxious as well. And you see that a lot in men, even who have high testosterone. Now, there's more refinement to that. There's DHT, which we'll talk about in a different segment, but progesterone is a big one for me. So I had heard about the benefits of progesterone for a long time, and I've been recommending it to women for a long time, and it tends to have very, very beneficial effects, although it's complicated, of course, because there's the menstrual cycle and there's various things going on. I hadn't really considered taking it for myself. Then maybe a year ago, I started reading about how small amounts of progesterone could even be beneficial for men. Tried a small amount, didn't really work. Didn't really do anything, so discontinued. Then I came across the work of Dr. Michael Platt, who we've recently done an interview with, and he recommends large amounts, even for men. And so I didn't believe him or not believe him, but I knew that it was safe enough that I was happy to try it. Even the people who say it's not great, bioidentical progesterone for men will say, yeah, stop taking it, and after a while you go back to how you were. So I figured the risk was small enough, the potential upside was large enough that I was willing to try it. The biggest claimed downside of progesterone, or a lot of progesterone for men, is really reduction in sex drive, reduction in libido, reduction in erection quality. But Dr. Michael Platt claimed that was not true at all if you used it at least in the way that he recommended. And I found it to be not true at all in my own personal experience. In fact, I would say because it's reduced stress, that if anything, it increases libido. Certainly hasn't reduced it. So that was the one downside that a lot of men are afraid of. My personal experience, that's not at all the case. Now, if you're dealing with a man with low testosterone and high estrogen and high prolactin, could the progesterone maybe lead to lower sex drive and libido? Yeah, maybe. Right? So that's the thing you have to balance.
Would that be progesterone's fault, or is that just because the other hormones are low?
What I'm saying is I think it's a combination rather than... So it's kind of its fault from the user's point of view because everything's the same and then they add progesterone and then it makes it even lower. But yeah, I get what you're saying. Really, it's more the lack of testosterone and the excess of the other, in men, libido crushing hormones, prolactin and estrogen, which is the problem. And then the progesterone is just tipping it even more in that direction. My experience is that didn't happen at all, but I think that may have been because I have high testosterone. I'm not sure, though. I haven't yet had a case study of someone with low testosterone who I give progesterone to who I recommend progesterone to without testosterone, right? If you've got low testosterone, you do have to deal with that as well. And I wouldn't just put progesterone on there. But for me, progesterone has been an absolute game changer. Dr. Michael Platt claims that not only does it reduce cortisol and adrenaline, which is the biggest benefit to me, but it also reduces insulin. And excess insulin, also referred to as insulin resistance, is one of the biggest contributors to most chronic diseases these days, along with high cortisol. Both chronically high cortisol and chronically high estrogen and insulin, they all have that ability to be lowered by progesterone. So that's pretty amazing to me.
So with progesterone, why would somebody decide, yes, that's for me? Like, why do they generally use it?
Well, yeah, men don't generally use it, right? I'm very much in the minority of this. Obviously, I'm not the only one. And I got the suggestion from a doctor who'd been in practice for, over 30 years, recommending it to a lot of men. So I'm certainly not the first, but it's usually used by women. And it's usually used by women when they start to feel perimenopausal, so premenopausal, but they're starting to feel like run down in various different ways. They're often getting, worse PMS symptoms, worse menstruation symptoms, and they're trying to kind of resolve that. So that's usually why it's recommended. Also, just to feel more youthful. Progesterone is really, not only does it reduce your experience of stress, but it really protects against the ravishing effects of excess stress due to kind of prematurely age you. So I think women usually do it because they want to, feel younger and they want to, feel more fertile. And yeah, it relates to attractiveness as well. I mean, so does estrogen in, different ways, but it can help you look and feel more youthful as a woman. That's the vast majority of people use it for that reason. What I would say in terms of that is, obviously it depends, but don't think you have to be premenopausal before considering it. Depending, if you're born with estrogen dominance, as many of us are, you may well be better off even considering it 25 years old, 30 years old, 35 years old. You don't have to wait until you're, advanced in age. And when you hear women who have started taking bioidentical progesterone at, whatever ages standard, like 45, 50, something like that, the number one piece of feedback I always hear is, God, I wish I'd have started a lot sooner. I wish I'd have started this years ago. So the only reason that I think people don't is for some of the things that we talked about at the beginning of this episode of, not wanting to be unnatural, which I feel like I've already addressed. We're already extremely unnatural. So, and then, being concerned that it's dangerous, it would be the other thing.
What's the best form of progesterone?
So there's two different types that are usually recommended. There's topical cream for transdermal application, and then there's also an oral type. The only type that I've used is transdermal and topical. The only type that I have spoken to people using who say they've had a great experience is topical and transdermal. Some people do use the oral version. Dr. Michael Platt says that when you do that, the progesterone is more likely to turn into allopregnanolone, which I actually want to talk about next. So allopregnanolone has some benefits over progesterone, but it also has some drawbacks. Just in a nutshell, and just a sentence, I would say the benefit of allopregnanolone is the same as the drawback, which is it's very sedating. So if you want to be calmed down and sedated, then that's what you want. But of course, if you want to be calm, but you also want to be mentally sharp and you want to be full of energy for the day, then transdermal progesterone is, unless you extremely overdo it, is not going to get in the way of that. Whereas oral progesterone is more likely to get in the way of that. And it is true that the people who I've seen who talk about having had an excess of progesterone, they are more commonly talking about oral progesterone, in my experience. So to me, transdermal is really where it's at. And it is, in fact, the type that is far more commonly recommended by bioidentical hormone doctors.
And I mean, there also is a synthetic version of progesterone, correct? Where's your preference?
100% bioidentical. If you Google benefits of progesterone or can progesterone help with any things that I've talked about today, you'll probably see a load of negative stuff about it. Here's the thing. They do not distinguish between bioidentical and synthetic. And usually in the medical community, they use, and in these research studies, they're using synthetic. Synthetic progesterone has a lot of potentially really bad consequences. And often, I don't want to say anything too controversial, but often it has the opposite effect of bioidentical progesterone. All the great stuff I've just said, flip it, basically. So you absolutely don't necessarily want to do that. Synthetic progesterone is what is often included in birth control pills. And I think these days there's a lot of understanding that birth control pills are really not a good thing.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I was asking somebody the other day because she told me she was on progesterone. And I thought, well, that should be helping with what you've got going on. And I asked her, I said, is it bioidentical? And she's like, I don't know. And then I was like, okay. So I was like, well, how would somebody figure that out if they say, yeah, I'm on progesterone, but, is it, I guess then if it's, if they're taking it orally versus transdermally, that's going to be a really big distinction there.
Yeah, it's not a foolproof way of being able to tell, but, if you're asking someone who really doesn't know, then if you say, is it a capsule or a tablet, and they say yes, then it's very likely it's the synthetic one.
Very good. Thank you for that. How would somebody use it?
So the transdermal one, you do have to apply it correctly. And correctly is not on hair, preferably, because hair actually has hormones that will affect the quality of the progesterone. And also not on fat. So not where there's a lot of subcutaneous fat. And so generally it's recommended to do it like on the inside arms, and then ideally somewhere where there's a lot of blood flow as well, so it can get into the blood flow. So often like the inside of the forearms is recommended because it tends to be low hair, low fat, and there's some big veins going along there. Dr. Michael Platt recommends the back of the neck, which I'm a big fan of. Wherever you actually apply progesterone, although it very quickly goes all throughout the body and a lot of it goes straight into your brain, nonetheless, it has a local effect as well. So, he talks about a lot of people hold a lot of tension in the back of the neck, so it can be really good to relieve that. And so that's my preferred place of putting it. And you can also put it on your ankles. That's another place with generally low hair, good blood flow, and low fat. But yeah, that's where you want to put it.
We're going to take a quick break to share with you one of our amazing sponsors, Genetic Insights. What makes Genetic Insights uniquely valuable is that they test over 83 million different variants, which guarantees a 99.7% accuracy on all of their DNA reports. With over 100 reports available, you get comprehensive insights into what your DNA is telling you about how to optimize your health today and in the future. I found reviewing my results to be incredibly accurate and applying some of the recommendations, which are personalized to your individual DNA, to be extremely helpful for me and my family. I also loved how easy it was to upload my raw DNA data that I already had from previously using Ancestry.com, because Genetic Insights supports uploading raw data from all major platforms. To get your health reports, go to geneticinsights.co and get 20% off today by using coupon code Rejuvenate. Remember that supporting our sponsors supports our podcast, which allows us to keep sharing this important information with you free of cost. So, go get your Genetic Insights health reports by going to geneticinsights.co and use coupon code Rejuvenate for 20% off today. And I mean, it sounds like it is a pretty safe hormone, but are there any safety concerns with this one?
It's sold as a dietary supplement in the US, which it's easy to overdose on it and it's dangerous to overdose on it, like with thyroid and like with testosterone, then it's not sold as a dietary supplement. Those two are not sold as a dietary supplement, I don't think, anywhere in the world. There's very few places in the world they're sold over the counter. So bioidentical progesterone is sold throughout most of the world as a dietary supplement, meaning that it is considered generally safe. Now, is there a downside to, and of course, because it's transdermal as well, it's pretty hard to overdose. You're like doing a pump and rubbing it on. There's only so much you can rub on your skin, especially if you're only rubbing it in the right places. Now, the other thing that's quite heartening in terms of safety is that even if you take, say, 100 milligrams, which is like way more than a lot of people take, and it's probably like the high-ish level that most people usually take. I mean, Dr. Michael Platt says maybe use a bit more when you first start to kind of top your levels up. But so that's a high amount. That raises your levels of blood progesterone so much less than pregnancy does for women. Like 1,000 milligrams of transdermal a day will not raise your progesterone anywhere near as high as the act of being pregnant does in a woman. And obviously there are some detrimental effects of pregnancy in women, but I don't believe any of them are caused by excess progesterone. They're caused by the baby using nutrients and pressing against the internal organs, and the extra weight at the front hurting, putting strain on your back. I mean, there's a lot of things that can create a problem, but I don't believe and understand the excess progesterone to be a problem at all in pregnant women. And in fact, it's extremely beneficial for them and the baby. So given that, almost no matter, so I'd say anything you can have 10 times as much accidentally and it's fine, is probably relatively safe, and if you have 10 times too much salt, you can really hurt yourself. If you 10 times the recommended daily ounce of salt, you can really hurt yourself. If you have 10 times the recommended daily amount of potassium, you can really hurt yourself. If you have 10 times the recommended daily amount of iron or zinc, you can really hurt yourself. So progesterone is safer than all of those things: salt, potassium, zinc, iron. So not totally safe, but safer than a lot of kitchen condiments.
I was going to ask because if someone is young, they're in the 20s, 30s, they're cycling, women, they are, menstruating, trying to get pregnant, should they alter how they use it, or can they use it every day, or should they seek some more information?
So what I've generally seen bioidentical doctors recommend is that you stop on the first day of your period, and then you stop for at least 10 days, and often they'll say 14 days, and then you start again at that point. So it's the second half of the period, and often that's the part that women don't feel as good, right? Especially the week before the period. And so that's where taking that bioidentical progesterone during that time often brings a big relief in the symptoms of PMS.
Now, I'm really glad you're talking about progesterone, because I think it's very, it's not widely out there. And I think, from the stuff that we have done, listening to you, going deeper with Dr. Michael Platt and also Dr. Ray P., that episode that we just recently did, there's a wealth of information there on progesterone and its benefits. So I do appreciate bringing this because as you said, it's the biggest anti-stress hormone, and there is so much going on in our bodies, and it would just make sense that this is something that we should definitely have. So yeah, this is really great information, Elwin. Thank you. So Elwin, what's next on the list?
So a hormone that I really love is allopregnanolone. Now, I would not recommend this necessarily for everyone, but I personally love it. So allopregnanolone is a metabolite of progesterone. We've talked about progesterone in the other section. I've talked about it in great detail on other videos. So what's the difference of allopregnanolone? So your body makes it out of progesterone. Progesterone is generally an anti-stress hormone, but it's not specifically sedating. It's more just calming. And as long as you don't really overdo it with progesterone, you should be just fine to still have energy, be mentally sharp, do everything you need to do. Now, with allopregnanolone, it is the strongest, or one of the strongest, endogenous GABA agonists.
So break that down for me. I think I know what it means, but yeah, just if you can clarify endogenous and agonist, and just so, we have it.
Okay, so endogenous means it's already naturally in your body, right? So Xanax and, alcohol, these are strong GABA agonists, but they're not Valium, but they're not natural in your body. Allopregnanolone is something that's naturally already inside your body. GABA agonist. So GABA is the number one neurotransmitter that makes you feel calm and at peace. As I said, Valium, Xanax, those are like the classics. But even with alcohol has other effects as well. But what does everyone say about alcohol? Have a drink, relax, chill out, lower your inhibitions, have fun. It's like it lowers that superego should part of your brain, and you're much more open and suggestible and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, I was going to say the kids would definitely have more chance of me saying yes if I'd already had a glass of wine. Just saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, they would probably also have the same effect if you had a lot of allopregnanolone, because it has the same effect. So I love it because I have not had this verified by testing, but I feel like I'm someone who's naturally low in GABA. And I am someone who's naturally high in cortisol and adrenaline. I do know that for a fact. And so GABA kind of opposes the effect of those excitatory neurotransmitters and hormones. It's often referred to as an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which is ironic because, they say by increasing GABA, you lower your inhibitions. So you're inhibiting your inhibitions, if that makes sense.
Okay.
When they say inhibitory, what they mean is it's like slowing it down. It's like the brake rather than the gas pedal. It's really as simple as that. So it's like putting the brake on the whole, excitation part of the central nervous system. So it calms you down, and it is actually, sedating. If you give someone enough allopregnanolone, which they do in a specific situation, it is actually used as a pharmaceutical applications. It's given to women with postpartum depression. And what they do in that case, they charge you like tens of thousands of dollars, and over 3 days, they put you in an IV drip of it, and they just load you up. They give you so much that you've got to be monitored 24 hours a day because your heart might get too slow and you might fall over. But that's because they're giving you loads of allopregnanolone, an amount that's so excessive that it could just, slow you down too much. And that is possible if you had a ridiculous amount of allopregnanolone like they give in that medical context. But what about if you just had a little bit? Now, is this strictly necessary? In many cases, I would say no. Just progesterone is plenty. But if you're really one of those people who really struggles to calm down, who really runs very stimulated, who has a kind of head that very much struggles to stop thinking, yes. So GABA is the biggest way to tell if you have enough GABA is how easy is it for you to calm your mind? Meditation, right? And so if that's a real struggle for you, that means that's a very strong indicator you don't have enough GABA. Just increasing the progesterone, which I've also recommended, may be enough for that. I personally like, though, to do progesterone during the day, and then I have allopregnanolone when I'm ready to go to sleep. Could I have it earlier in the day? Say if I was upset about something? Yeah, I don't get upset about very many things, it seems, anymore, unless they're, actually real problems, which of course still happen with the progesterone. So yes, you technically could use it to calm yourself at any point. But for me, what I like it for is to just get my brain to shut off, fall asleep easily, and then sleep more deeply without, my mind being able to wake me up.
And so let's say for somebody that's out there in the world, and they're like, okay, yeah, that takes my it's hard for my brain to shut off. I wake up in the middle of the night and I can't go back to sleep because my brain is going. So then would this be for them? Who is this for?
Yeah, if I would go with the progesterone first these days, because your body can make its own allopregnanolone out of progesterone. So, but if the progesterone is not enough to calm you down, even at the high doses that we've talked about when we have talked about progesterone, then it could be like an icing on the cake. It could be, okay, you're already calm, but now you're actually sedated. Now you're actually sleepy. Or maybe you're very upset and progesterone isn't enough to calm you down. As I said, that might be another time when you would go with allopregnanolone to guarantee the calm down. To me, I like having it there as well as a, like a fallback, last resort if I ever go into or someone around me ever goes into a state of real panic, or like where there may be a danger to others or themselves because they're that panicking, maybe making rash decisions or whatever, like something that will just work to calm you down. Now, does it work at the amount that I normally recommend and use, like 1 drop, 1 milligram? It may not take you from a hyper state to sedated, but if you take enough of it, it will sedate you. So, yeah, that's I think it's a good thing if you can afford it and find it to have around, even if you don't need it, just because in my opinion, it's better than things like Xanax or Valium because it's natural. It's already something that's contained within your body. It's not habit forming. It's not addictive, unlike those substances. It's obviously not habit forming and addictive because, as I said, the only medical use for it is pumping people absolutely full of it for 3 days and then sending them off and not giving them any more. So obviously it's not habit forming because, when would you ever do that? When would you pump someone full of a maximum dose of a habit forming drugs for 3 days and then send them off? I mean, you would never do that. So it's obviously not habit forming. And so for that reason, I like the idea of at least having it around.
And what would be, you mentioned a drop. What is the best form of allopregnanolone?
So the only form that I've seen is like a drop, which in oil, which can either be used on the tongue or on the skin. I've experimented with both, and I must say I have found it to be more effective on the tongue, but that's me. I think some people might feel differently. If so, like I talked about when I talked about progesterone, it may back up Dr. Michael Platt's point, which is that your body more easily metabolizes progesterone into allopregnanolone when you use it orally. Maybe for whatever reason, even if you use allopregnanolone orally, it's more effective than using it transdermally. So that's my personal experience, but you could certainly try both.
And so how would somebody use it? You talked about whether, they're going to use it in their mouth or on their skin, but also if you could say, is this something that they should do every day, or is it only in situ of, when they're feeling this ampedness?
Yeah, I would say if you're feeling it. If every day you struggle to get to sleep because your brain is racing, then maybe use it every day. But if that only happens to you occasionally, maybe only use it occasionally. I would not use it like, the B vitamins, like just because it's always a good idea. I would not use it in that way. I would use it as a if needed basis only, because of course, is it possible to be too sedated? Of course it is, so you definitely don't want to overdo it and you don't want to use it if you don't need it.
Are there any safety concerns beyond just feeling really sedated?
Not that I'm aware of beyond feeling really sedated, but we don't want to minimize the potential dangers of being over sedated. I have not seen any case of it happening to anyone. And I think because it's something that your body produces itself, it's less likely to be dangerous than kind of artificial sedatives like a Valium or a Xanax. But nonetheless, I would not play around with having an excessive amount of it. I would be very cautious with it just in case, even though I've not seen any evidence that I need to be cautious, because it does have that sedating effect. And because of, as I said, the only use of it is to give the massive doses, and then people do have to be monitored. Excessively sedated is dangerous, right? You can fall and you can crack your skull. Possibly your heart rate will go so low that, usually that's not a danger because your adrenals kick in and it will raise your heart rate again. But in certain situations, that can be an issue. Don't operate heavy machinery while, under the influence. It's all that kind of stuff. That's all I'm aware of.
So what I'm learning here is the difference between progesterone and allopregnanolone is the progesterone is the anti-stress hormone with a calming effect, but you can still get a lot done. But whereas Allop is more calming, but more sedating in that avenue. So they're two very distinct things, even though allopregnanolone is made from progesterone, but they have their differences.
They definitely have their differences, yeah. I would say progesterone first, allopregnanolone only if you really desire and require sedation.
So, Elwin, what's next on the list?
So, DHEA is an excellent hormone that I often refer to as the youth hormone. So a lot of hormones go downhill as you get older, but DHEA is one of the most drastic. And it's one of the first things that the kind of scientific researchers found out about it when they first discovered it, is just what a big difference there is between younger people and older people. And so because of that, they assumed that, if you could increase your DHEA again, that you could go back to being youthful. Maybe hopeful thinking, right? But that was the idea. So if a 20-year-old... if a 60-year-old has 80% less than a 20-year-old, so let's say, 20-year-old has 100 units, 60-year-old only has 20 units. That's a massive drop-off. So the theory was that if we could boost that right back up again with supplementation, so it's the same as a 20-year-old, then they'll feel like a 20-year-old. Unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that. DHEA has a lot of very varied effects. Now, DHEA is often just thought of as a precursor to testosterone and estrogen. And that's because it is. So your body makes testosterone out of DHEA primarily, and then it makes estrogen out of DHEA as well, or it can make estrogen out of testosterone. So it's often thought of in that light, but in fact, it has a lot of its own interesting benefits as well. I think one of the reasons that it hasn't really caught on is because its effects can be a little bit unpredictable. I personally find it to be very stimulating, and I find it to be brain stimulating, but in a good way. Like, to me, it sharpens up cognition, improves memory, improves recall, and that's documented. That's not just my opinion. There's a lot of work, research and evidence about how it has that effect. But there's also evidence that it helps people sleep better at night. Completely conversely. So I've seen some bioidentical hormone doctors recommend to have it in the morning to give you energy, but I've seen some recommend to have it at night to help you sleep better. It really seems to depend. So let's look at what it actually is. So DHEA is made by the adrenal glands. So it is actually an adrenal hormone. The ones that we tend to think of as adrenal hormones are like cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, maybe also aldosterone. But we don't tend to think of DHEA as an adrenal hormone, but it technically is, even though usually it's thought of as more a sex hormone because it's turned into the major sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen. So I personally love it because of the energizing effect of it. Now, the way I look at it, as I said, it's an adrenal hormone. So DHEA often it's the balance of it to cortisol, which is really important. So cortisol is also a stimulating hormone, but cortisol is catabolic and DHEA is anabolic. So cortisol tends to, although it can lead to fat gain kind of indirectly, and certainly potentially does, because cortisol can, lower thyroid hormone, which can lead to fat gain, or cortisol can lead to excess estrogen, which can lead to fat gain. So indirectly, cortisol can lead to fat gain, but technically on its own, cortisol is actually a catabolic hormone. It relates to tearing down of body tissues rather than building up. And unfortunately, what it tends to be specifically tearing down is muscle tissue rather than fat, which is why cortisol is not used as a way of, losing weight. But it is a catabolic hormone. DHEA is the opposite. It's an anabolic hormone. So it's something that builds up, especially, again, muscle. Now, if someone is young and in their prime and takes DHEA, will it help them gain muscle? The research says no. But if someone is 60 and their DHEA is really low, does increasing their DHEA help them to gain muscle mass? The science says yes. So it's not that it's necessarily like a steroid, testosterone thing that will make you put on more and more muscle no matter what, but it is something that a lack of it will lead to that process. So the way I look at it, what I like about it is, first of all, it balances my tendency to have high cortisol, because you want to have a good balance between those two. And I find it has a lot of the energizing and also anti-inflammatory benefits that cortisol does, but without that kind of more stress, anxiety feel to it. However, that's at a certain level. I find that too much DHEA is actually overstimulating for me. So I still have to find the right balance and the right level of it. But it makes me feel youthful. Just to go back to the youth hormone. Like, it gives me more like energy and enthusiasm and stuff like that.
How does that differentiate then from thyroid in this way? Because you're saying the DHEA is energizing, it's got this youthfulness, it's working on energy, it has a balance with cortisol as well. So how does that differentiate here?
Yeah, it's a good question. Maybe in terms of subjectively, not much, but in terms of the mechanism, so thyroid is energizing by ATP production, My understanding of DHEA is it's more energizing in the way that dopamine is energizing. It does have some effect of modulating and increasing dopamine, rather than, and in fact, I think, we understand that dopamine makes us feel certain things. I think there's not enough understanding that DHEA also makes us feel something. This is what I was saying. So cortisol makes us feel that kind of stressed kind of energy. Dopamine makes us feel that more motivated, enthusiastic, passionate energy. I think DHEA has its own quality of, I'd call it mental energy behind it, as opposed to either of those two types of energy. But it's more like an experience of energy as opposed to the building block of energy itself, ATP, which is what thyroid is specifically helping with. Now, it has a lot of knock-on benefits on all of it. So DHEA is in the kind of good guy category of hormones. So it supports thyroid, it supports progesterone, it supports testosterone, it supports, pregnenolone, which we've talked about. So it's kind of on the good guy side, and then it's, helping to reduce cortisol. It's helping to, in certain circumstances, it can help to, reduce serotonin, reduce noradrenaline, stuff like that. Now, there is a potential downside to DHEA if you overdo it. Too much DHEA can turn into, in general, DHEA, once you've got enough. So one of the reasons I feel confident to take DHEA is because my blood tests say I'm low in the reference range. So for me, it's safe because even if I take, 25, 50 milligrams a day, I'm still going to be medium in the reference range. So I'm not excessive. Does that make sense? If you're already high in the reference range for DHEA, I would not supplement DHEA. Definitely. I would not supplement it without testing, first of all, blood levels of DHEA. I also would not test it without without testing blood levels of estrogen. And if you're a woman, without testing blood levels of testosterone. I think women having excess estrogen is actually pretty rare, especially when they get older. We'll talk about that in a different segment. But certainly both sexes have a tendency to excess estrogen, especially men by the time they hit their 40s. And so DHEA can be turned into testosterone or estrogen. The more that you're in a stressed, inflamed, unhealthy, low energy producing state, the more it will be turned into estrogen. So unfortunately, it's not this panacea of youthfulness that they originally envisaged, because people are already kind of in a mess hormonally and, health-wise. Often they'll convert too much of the DHEA into estrogen, which will actually make the situation worse.
So if I'm a highly stressed individual and I think, taking DHEA could be a really great idea, and not saying it isn't, but there's a risk there potentially that by me taking that DHEA, it could just be turned into estrogen and increasing more stress and increasing more of what I don't want. Exactly.
And so medical doctors I've seen, like Dr. Platt, for instance, he talks about how he doesn't recommend, he loves to give DHEA to people who need it because it's very beneficial, but he doesn't love to give it to people who already have excess estrogen. If they have low estrogen, he'll give them a lot of DHEA if they need it. If they have, medium estrogen, he'll give them a little bit of DHEA, but he's very aware of that possibility. And so I think that's wise. I would take the same approach myself as well. And so, as I say, the only reason I use it is because I have like medium estrogen and I have low DHEA and I have high cortisol. So all of that together means some more DHEA to, give my brain a boost to balance out the cortisol, and I can do it without worrying about excess estrogen, especially excess estrogen in relation to testosterone, because I've got high testosterone. So it works for me, but it doesn't work for everyone. So yeah, you want to take it only if it's appropriate for you.
So what would be the best form?
It is sold in a different form called 7-keto DHEA. That type has none of the downside that I just talked about with estrogen. That type is generally recommended actually to boost metabolism. So that gets even more complicated with your earlier question about how is it different from thyroid.
So maybe I should. I don't know, or that person should.
So that 7-keto form is basically sold as like a weight loss thing. I don't know. Most weight loss things often don't work because the factors leading to like weight gain and not being able to lose weight are often significant enough that it's very difficult to counteract them. But it's potentially worth a try. It's cheap, it's side effect free, relatively. So why not in many cases? It's thermogenic, so it can, increase your body heat. So yeah, the more I'm thinking about it, Chris, you're actually right. It does share a lot of properties with thyroid, and it is, something. But again, like it's youthfulness, right? As we've talked about in detail with the metabolism episode, high metabolism is, one of the main markers of youthfulness, and so. Yeah, I guess the more I think about it, I think you're right. We could put DHEA in a very similar category from thyroid to also support the metabolism. But as I said, for me, I wouldn't use it for that purpose because thyroid is much more relevant for that. I would use it more for the purpose of boosting energy, especially mental energy.
Yeah, I mean, and depending if you don't have the right form, there is a risk over here of that DHEA turning into estrogen, which we don't want. So yeah. Okay.
Yes. And so other than the 7-keto DHEA, which is sold as capsules, there is just DHEA sold as a capsule. And so that's basically how you would take it. I see some people also selling it transdermally. If you use it transdermally, it's especially if you apply it to an area of hair, it's going to have like a different effect again. It's actually more likely to be turned into testosterone in the body because you have something called 5-alpha reductase on your hair follicles, which will then potentially, not necessarily, depending on everything else, like convert it more into testosterone. So some guys use it that way because they want to boost their testosterone without actually buying testosterone. But if you want it just as DHEA, I think, taking capsule is by far the simplest thing to do.
And we mentioned some of the safety concerns with it potentially being turned into something that we don't want, but are there any other safety concerns that you want to mention?
Again, if we use it, is it safe? And if you accidentally took way too much and you called 911, would they send an ambulance? Probably not. And that's why it's allowed to be sold as a dietary supplement. I put it, again, at least as safe as salt or potassium or iron or zinc. It's relatively safe.
Yeah, so there's a few things to unpack there. So what I'm hearing is DHEA is really helpful for the brain, youthfulness, things like that. Again, and we talked about it being similar to the thyroid, but of course there are differences as well.
Those are just my favorites, by the way, but it's been shown to be helpful for cardiovascular health. It's been shown to be helpful for immune health. It's been shown to be helpful for digestive health. Like it's got a full spectrum of potential benefits. It's actually really wide reaching. As I said, it's one of those things like thyroid. It feels like most people would benefit from some. It just depends on how much. Maybe for some people, it's just a very little bit. For DHEA, if you already have a lot of DHEA, it's not going to help you to have more.
Right. And let me ask you this, because there is that concern with down-regulating. If somebody is taking DHEA, will it down-regulate in their body?
My understanding of that is no. Again, things sold as dietary supplement, the amount it down-regulates is minimal, if at all. So with progesterone, with DHEA, it's fairly minimal, which is why it's allowed to be sold as a dietary supplement. And in fact, it may even have the opposite effect. This DHEA, along with pregnenolone and progesterone and thyroid, was one of the favorites of both of the doctors we've referred to a lot, Dr. P and Dr. Platt. And I know at least Dr. P has said, if you use it, it can kickstart your body's own production. So it can actually be the opposite. Rather than down-regulating, it can start a kind of virtuous cycle where your body then is keeping the level high on its own.
Okay, good. No, thank you for that. Well, Elwin, I know we have an extensive list and we're coming to it right now. So we'll put a pause here and we will continue this conversation at a later date. So everyone, again, thank you for joining us. Make sure you watch out for part 2 because there's so much more to come. So thank you again. Please hit the like button and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that episode. Take care and we'll see you next time.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that video. You may have noticed I recommended a few different videos in that episode. And one of the ones I recommend is just here, if you want to click there. Or another one I recommend is just below, if you want to click on that one and watch that next.